Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into a highly specific and honestly pretty fascinating theological framework. We're talking about the invisible realm and the intense spiritual warfare described in our source material. Whether you're deeply familiar with these concepts or you're just exploring them for the very first time, this framework offers a really unique lens. It asks us to look at human struggles not merely as physical or psychological issues, but as deeply spiritual battles. We're going to impartially unpack the deep architecture of this worldview, exactly as the source presents it.
Okay, let's take a quick look at our roadmap for how this worldview redefines our daily struggles. We'll be covering 1. The universe next door, 2. A shift in paradigm, 3. The secret spiritual identity, 4. Strategies of the enemy, and finally, 5. The rules of engagement. Let's get right into it. The source hooks us right out of the gate with some pretty profound questions. Are we victims or are we players? It really makes you wonder, right? Are we just collateral damage in some massive cosmic pinball game, or do we actually have a definitive, active role? The text challenges you right away to stop viewing yourself as a passive victim of circumstance or biology, and instead consider your active placement in an unseen war.
All right, Section 1, the universe next door. This is the absolute bedrock premise that everything else in this explainer is built on. So according to this framework, there is a parallel universe literally right next door. And it's not empty. It's populated by both good and bad spirit beings that are actively operating right here in our physical realm. The source describes a universe where the Holy Spirit and ministering angels are aiming to help us, right alongside the devil and fallen angels whose specific goal is to do us harm. There's no neutral ground here at all. The invisible maps directly over the visible, which means this unseen warfare intrinsically includes all of us.
And this brings us to a really core concept, that human existence is essentially dual-natured. You participate in both worlds at the same time. The text really insists that you aren't just a physical body wandering through a material world. No, your daily life, your decisions, your struggles, they're simultaneously echoing in and being influenced by this parallel spiritual dimension. Moving on to Section 2, a shift in paradigm. Let's see how this builds into a complete mental shift regarding our emotional and mental health.
Now, what's really interesting here is the stark contrast between modern psychiatry and the source's spiritual framework. In the secular view, science rules, right? Hearing voices gets you a label of schizophrenia, and depression is purely a chemical disease you treat with a pill. But this spiritual framework challenges that head-on. It suggests that if we assume the biblical texts are true, non-flesh and blood rulers and spiritual forces of evil are actually the underlying root cause of these immense human problems.
The author then outlines an updated paradigm. Instead of seeing the world, the flesh, and the devil as three totally separate enemies, this framework consolidates them. The devil is viewed as the singular primary enemy, the power source, who tactically operates and animates his attacks specifically through the surrounding worldly culture and through our very own flesh.
That brings us to Section 3, the secret spiritual identity. And to understand the battlefield itself, we have to look at a very specific and quite surprising definition of the flesh.
So, the crucial takeaway here is that the flesh is defined as much more than just your physical body. It's described as an intelligent, animated artifact of past trauma and defective coping mechanisms. It carries your childhood personality traits, deeply ingrained habits, and these pockets of hurt. The source claims that even after a spiritual conversion, believers carried this flesh around literally like an albatross around their neck, constantly trying to reassert control over them.
But here's the twist. The text posits that believers actually possess a secret, incredibly powerful identity that is seated in heavenly places. But the enemy, he is desperately trying to keep that identity locked up and hidden behind the earthly curtain of the flesh. So the struggle we're talking about is literally about getting your invisible, spiritually empowered identity to break through that curtain of old traumas so it can actually express itself in the physical world. To access that locked-up power, the source points to a unilateral new covenant and what it calls a double-double union with Christ. This union involves both death and resurrection, and the theological claim here is absolutely massive. Because of this union, the framework says the believer is reigning right now. Not potentially, not just someday in the future, right now. The text even states believers have absolute authority over spiritual forces, are literally more powerful than Satan, and will one day judge angels. The author playfully asks, "It's 4:45 p.m. Do you know where your identity is?" It's a great wake-up call. It reminds the audience that they are designed to be extensions of divine glory reigning in the universe. If you forget this secret identity while you're just, going about your late afternoon errands, the framework argues you're leaving yourself entirely vulnerable to the enemy's tactics. Speaking of tactics, Let's jump to Section 4, Strategies of the Enemy. Now that the players are defined, how exactly does the enemy wage this war? The framework lists 3 primary vulnerabilities: the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. And it emphasizes that the enemy is essentially a one-trick pony. Because he cannot physically overpower someone who holds that massive secret spiritual identity, his only real weapon is deception. The goal is to trick individuals into meeting their legitimate needs, like emotional fulfillment or significance, apart from God, by using the lusts and pride embedded in their flesh.
A major tactical strategy outlined by the author is isolation. The enemy wants you to live totally one-dimensionally, completely ignoring spiritual realities and relying only on your own exhaustion. By working against your deep relationships, especially in marriage and family, the strategy is to isolate and wear you down into such despair that you just stop praying and start believing the spiritual life simply doesn't work. The author actually puts it perfectly. He tries to get us to accept the old man as our true identity. This brilliantly shows how the enemy leverages those childhood personality traits we talked about. If he can convince you that your past trauma, your defective coping mechanisms, and your bad habits are who you truly are, you will voluntarily surrender all that immense spiritual power and lock yourself back behind the curtain. We're also heavily warned against living strictly by feelings generated by the flesh. The source suggests the enemy dictates your behavior by making what feels good seem right. All the while, he's trying to make you passive towards spiritual disciplines, while getting you super energized and excited about trivial, lesser things in the physical world.
And here is perhaps the most psychological claim in the entire explainer: the idea that the enemy actively plants false thoughts in a person's mind, disguised as their own inner voice. The framework argues the deception is so incredibly subtle that a person will internalize a spiritually destructive thought, completely assuming it was just their own organic idea or even divine guidance, falling right into the trap.
All right, final section, Section 5, the rules of engagement. Let's see exactly how a believer is instructed to counter these really sophisticated strategies.
First, the source draws a very strict theological boundary, clarifying the difference between demonic possession and demonic oppression. It states definitively that possession, meaning total internal ownership, is totally impossible for a Christian. However, they can suffer from severe external spiritual attack and bondage, which is oppression. The outward expressions might look similar to us, but the internal spiritual mechanics are entirely different.
Because of that, the rules of engagement dictate that believers are not actually fighting for victory. Rather, they are stepping up to enforce a victory that has already been won. According to this paradigm, the believer is already enthroned. The enemy is already defeated, but just refuses to admit it. So the daily spiritual battle isn't a desperate struggle for survival. It's an active campaign to enforce a settled win and take back territory.
The whole dynamic is captured in this amazing analogy from the text. He is like a lion looking for food. You are like a lion hunter with a bazooka. It's an unforgettable way to remind the reader of the massive power imbalance in the believer's favor, provided they know who they are. The enemy might roar to cause intimidation, but according to this worldview, he's ultimately on a leash. The believer holds all the firepower. They just have to recognize it.
So it leaves us with this really fascinating paradigm to consider. If this invisible warfare is truly happening all around us, what are you going to do with your bazooka? Whether you view this strictly as theological doctrine or as a deeply compelling psychological metaphor for overcoming human struggles, the framework challenges us to stop viewing ourselves as one-dimensional victims. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer today as we unpacked this worldview. We'll see you next time.